Hello, everyone. My name is Alina Rocha Menocal, and I am the director of the Thinking Working Politically Community of Practice. Thank you so much for tuning in. For the March-April 2025 edition of the TWP Community of Practice newsletter, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ronnie Ojwang, who is the country director of the Kenya office of the Netherlands Institute for Multiparty Democracy, or in short, NIMD. Ronnie has over 12 years of experience working on political party development, civil society strengthening, youth inclusion, and the prevention and countering of violent extremism. He has also worked and consulted with a number of international organizations, including NIMD, of course, but also the National Democratic Institute, the UNDP in Kenya, BBC Media Action, Mercy Corps, and the AI Global in Kenya and the Horn of the Africa region. I will turn to our guest speaker in a moment, but I wanted to briefly say something about NIMD for those of you who may be less familiar with the organization. So in essence, NIMD works to promote peaceful, just, inclusive, and prosperous democracies across the world. And as the name would suggest, Netherlands, it is located in the Netherlands. It seeks to work on this idea of a more peaceful and just world by bringing people together across political divides and fostering trust and respectful dialogue between politicians, political parties, civil society, and citizens. And as part of this, it works with politicians as well as with aspiring political leaders and civil society activists, focusing in particular on women and youth to equip them with the skills, knowledge, and networks that they might need for participating more meaningfully in the political process. NIMD has developed a multi-pronged approach over the years to democratic strengthening that focuses on a few different things, including at the system level of fostering an enabling political environment, and also at the cultural level, seeking to instill democratic values among stakeholders and to promote behavior that is aligned with democratic principles, which today more than ever seem to be very much needed. NIMD works on 5 broad themes, which include dialogue, democracy education, women in politics, youth in politics, and democratic infrastructure. We will not get to the core of all of these different areas of work, but rather I will be speaking with Ronnie about particular work that he has been leading on in Kenya. So without further ado, Ronnie, let me turn over to you now. And perhaps as a way to kick us off, you can tell us a little bit about the work that NIMD has been doing in Kenya and how long it has been working there.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you for that very comprehensive introduction and even introducing me and the experience I have. It's really interesting just hearing someone else introduce you and the experience you had. That's when it really hits how much work one has done. So I've worked with NIMD for the past, this is the 3rd year since I joined the organization. NIMD has been working in Kenya for slightly over 20 years. Initially, NIMD was working through a local partner, a national-based implementing partner called the Center for Multiparty Democracy, that was working with about 6 to 8 political parties, doing a lot of political party strengthening work, inclusion work, targeting youth, women, and persons with disabilities and other minorities. Then towards the end of 2019, going to 2020, just before COVID, NIMD began working with another national-based partner by the name Zalendo Trust, and most of their work has been on open parliament, open government, post-legislative scrutiny, facilitating public participation on various legislations in the National Assembly and Senate of Kenya. However, going into the 2022 elections, an opportunity came up whereby NIMD was the lead partner in implementing an EU-funded grant, which presented the opportunity to fully set up office in Kenya. And that's the point where I officially came on board as the country director. And so in Kenya, I think just to narrow down onto what we've been doing in Kenya, it's been largely political dialogue work, which is a key thematic area for Kenya, for NIMD globally. But in Kenya, we've been working with our platform by the name Political Parties Liaison Committee. So it's a multi-party dialogue platform meant to bring together the Electoral Commission of Kenya, the Registrar of Political Parties, and all registered political parties to have conversations on electoral reforms, election administration, and management. On the other hand, we've also been working on through our democracy education theme, which has focused more on our democracy school and democracy academy interventions, whereby the democracy academy intervention is focused on elected and nominated members of the National Assembly and Senate, while democracy school is focused on young people who are in political parties, civil society organizations, university and tertiary institutions. So those have been the main core areas of the work NIMD has been doing in Kenya. However, also implementing through the other national-based organizations, which is Muzalendo Trust, as well as the Center for Multiparty Democracy, through this through our EU-based funding. Yeah. So in a nutshell, that's the work we've been doing. There's a lot more.
Yeah.
I'll go into as we proceed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ronnie. So it sounds like you have, or NIMD rather, has a rather long track record in Kenya. You said 20 years, I believe. And you came on board with this new dedicated NIMD country office. Just out of curiosity, has the body of work changed as a result of having this NIMD dedicated office, or has the focus always been on this inter-party dialogue and the democracy schools?
So it has changed a little bit, because initially through the work we initially did with our national-based partner, it was mainly focused on political dialogue, a lot of cross-party, multi-party kind of engagement on electoral and political reform, on governance issues, or any other issues that could be of national interest. Excuse me. In the lead up to the 2007 election and the period after, there was a lot of polarization. So there was need for a lot of cross-party kind of conversations and engagements. And that was a key focus area for NIMD through its partner at the time. But through the EU funding we got, that's where now we brought on board our other interventions, our democracy school, democracy education interventions, targeting traditionally underrepresented groups of youth, women, persons with disabilities, trying to ensure that they're well equipped, to participate in politics, in governance in general, or get into leadership. But it also brought an extra layer where we started out a democracy academy, that's what we call it, democracy academy intervention that's targeting elected representatives, because that is work that's not clearly fully been done by NIMD in other countries.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but in Kenya it was that deliberate, where we're working with about 16, 17 members of the National Assembly and Senate through the Democracy Academy program, where we'd focus on one module per month or per retreat, and just work with them slowly, 1 year after they got elected.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of the difference based on previous work we've done over the past 20 years.
That's really interesting, Ronnie. And you mentioned the earlier history. Well, not so far in the distance, but the history of political violence around elections in Kenya in the 2000s. And I'm wondering, before I do want to speak with you more about the Democracy School and the Democracy Academy and the work that you've been doing with young people and future political leaders in Kenya. But I'm wondering, can you tell us a little bit about the political context in Kenya, especially since the 2022 elections? Because there seems to be quite a bit of unrest as well. I don't know if it's different in nature from what you had earlier, but there have been a lot of protests, especially among young people. So I'm wondering if you can give us a sense of what the context is, so that we can then launch into the work that you're doing with these young people and future political leaders. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think to just start with, Kenya is a constitutional democracy that has regular elections every 5 years. We've had, I think, 7 elections since 1992. That's when the country transitioned to become a multi-party democracy. And since the promulgation of the current constitution in 2010, we've had 3 elections under the current constitution. And of course, the elections have come with a lot of tension between the two key political actors. There's been a bit of election-related violence due to disputes around the presidential election, not to the scale of what we experienced in 2007, but it's been there, and a lot of tension following the announcement of the final results. We've had disputes taken to the Supreme Court on the presidential election. We had one presidential election that was nullified by the Supreme Court in the year 2017. So there's been that kind of tense environment around elections over the years. But the new constitution, which has been in effect for about 15 years, put together all manner of safeguards to ensure that if there are disputes, this is how they're meant to be resolved. And that's how we have the creation of the Supreme Court that arbitrates on the presidential election alone, if there's a dispute, within a very structured timeline. So with that in mind, of course, we've still had, civil unrest. We had a lot of it in 2017. In 2022, it was not as much, but there was a lot of political tension between the two top presidential candidates and their coalitions. Going into 2023, the whole world is feeling the effects of the Ukraine war. So of course, it had a negative impact within the Kenyan local economy. We had the effects of COVID as well in that period. So of course, there was inflation, there was a lot of loss of jobs. The new administration had come in, and they're trying to put in place measures to manage our public debt following the 2022 elections. So there was a bit of unrest, but that unrest in 2023 was largely led by the opposition coalition. Because in that time, there were also new taxation that was being proposed that the opposition felt was not necessary at the time. Then going into 2024, last year, the government came up with new taxation once again, that increased taxes further up. But in doing so, there are also a lot of cases of corruption, lack of transparency in how funds are being utilized. And so what began as the normal budget-making process and putting in place new taxation leading to June last year, spilled over. There was a lot of public negativity and dissatisfaction on the new legislation. And it started off online on digital media platforms where, new taxation laws were being discussed online and the kind of impact it will have on citizens. And what started off online spilled over to the streets, where there was more or less an organic reaction to all the new taxation that was being brought in. And most young people were feeling that even with current taxation, the government is not doing enough. The government is not plugging all the corruption loopholes and everything, and they're already increasing taxation on an already overburdened population. And so that was more or less the trigger that led to the civil unrest last year. But other issues were also brought in, corruption, transparency, accountability, a leadership, political leadership that's not really responsive to the views and issues of young people, or even the population in general. And this was largely led by what people have called the Gen Z generation, those who are aged between, within 18 to 23, thereabout, because they mobilized themselves organically on social media. We had a few big influencers who came in and perhaps gave them a bit of a boost, but it was largely that group that was organizing themselves. Their parents, who are probably millennials and boomers, were also supportive of them going to the streets. There were a lot of, I saw a lot of that on social media, where parents are telling their children, you can go to the streets. But of course, we saw how it went out, where the government and security forces came heavy on protesters. We had a lot of injuries, we had a lot of shootings and killings. And of course, abductions later on in the year. Of course, that, in a sense, slowed down the momentum. But there was still an impact in terms of young people pulling together their voices and just ensuring that they are heard, because it had an impact at the time. That law was withdrawn by the government. The president ended up firing his entire cabinet and replacing those he felt were not performing. So there are some changes made to the casual eye that was as a result of that movement at the time.
Yeah, I think you're putting your finger on something really important that we're seeing, not only in what you're discussing in Kenya, but more generally about dissatisfaction with how democracy is working and what people can do to try to get their governments to be more responsive to their needs. So this is really interesting. And I'm wondering, against that backdrop and that context that you're discussing, could you tell us a little bit about NIMD's work with young men and women in particular? You're saying Gen Z generation, but also millennials in a way. And what the Democracy School or Democracy Academy is trying to achieve given that context and those tensions.
Yeah, so I think just to circle back to the last election in Kenya, I think in terms of voter turnout, we had more or less what one would say the lowest voter turnout when it comes to those who turned out to vote during the general election. And there was a group of young people who were eligible to vote, eligible to be registered voters, would-be voters. Some of them had their voters' cards, but elected not to vote because they felt that it will not really make a difference in their lives. And so when we have that backdrop and discussions we've had with key people working in this sector, those are thinking that that's the group that largely came out to the streets last year, because they also had it in terms of a government that's they felt is not fully responsive to their needs and their interests. So with that backdrop and with the programming we have at NIMD Kenya, earlier in the year, a few months before even conversations about new taxation came in and all the conversations on social media started, we'd made a decision to have our democracy school intervention target young people aged between 18 to around 22, 23. So those are the ones who are more or less getting into college or university or trying to figure out what they want to do with their careers. Because we felt that this group is not very targeted when it comes to democracy education or leadership related kind of interventions. But we felt that if we are able to equip them well, they'd be able to make the necessary right choices leading up to the next election. So if it's even at an individual level, because the intervention is not there to push people to vie for elective seats. It's just there to raise awareness among, within that age group. And so that's a key decision we made. And so leading up to everything, all the civil unrest we experienced in June, July, August, September, we felt that we made the right choice in terms of targeting that group. And even with our first cohort, our second cohort, we've been very deliberate with that grouping, and we've had a lot more interest of young people wanting to raise their knowledge, increase their knowledge and skills on how they can best participate in various political processes or governance processes at either the national or subnational level. And so it's been really fulfilling just working with them, because these young people are they're very knowledgeable, they're very engaged, they want to make a difference in their communities, in their neighborhoods, in small ways. Some of them run community-based organizations that are doing civic education. So by coming to the school, the idea is for us to just equip them a bit more and see whatever gaps they have and try and fill them, and just raise their confidence, increase their confidence in how they can really engage with fellow young people within their communities. So that was a very deliberate decision we made. As a country office.
Can you tell me a little bit about how it was that NIMD was able to engage those young people who, but what you're saying, had been sort of willfully detaching themselves from the political process, not voting? How was NIMD able to reach them? And then also, if perhaps you can tell us a little bit about how you selected the different cohorts that you're talking about and how large of a group we're talking about each time. Thank you.
So we initially reached out to various partners we've been working with, political parties. We reached out to a number of political parties. We reached out to a number of youth-led, youth-owned civil society organizations working with young people, college and university student unions. We also reached out to them, and we invited them into a design workshop and presented the program to them and got their input, into the modules, the curriculum, delivery, and everything that pertains to the school. Just ensuring that it provides a very conducive learning environment for the target group we were seeking to bring on board. So of course that helped, whereby bringing the key actors together and designing. Thereafter, they were able to nominate. So for the first cohort, we asked the organizations that were part of the design workshops to nominate young people from their respective organizations to be part of the inaugural cohort. But for the subsequent cohorts, we opened up the application process. It was a public, open application process where we had a poster on our social media pages, and we had a link, and we had a form that young people were asked to, if you're interested, fill the form, provide a personal statement on your leadership journey or trajectory, and that was reviewed internally. So when we opened it up, in the initial cohort, we only had about 25 participants for the initial cohort. But once we opened it up to the public, for the 1 month period, we got close to over 150 applications. And for each cohort, we can only take about 35 young people per cohort. And so we had to review the applications to ensure that they're well filled. And even as we're selecting and we're speaking to potential students into the school, we also had to ensure that the participants are representative of all the major geographic regions in Kenya. We're looking at the minority communities. We're looking at those young people who've not participated in any leadership programs, and And just reading their personal statements and just seeing how much interest they want and what they, where they see themselves in a year or two or in 5 years. So of course, that now more or less determined how we were selecting students into the democracy school. Yeah.
That's quite an achievement to go from the numbers you're talking about. That's really amazing. Hopefully you have waiting lists that people can move up.
We actually have a waiting list. We have a waiting list.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I'm a bit familiar with the NIMD democracy schools through some work that I did with NIMD in Tunisia. And what really struck me about that experience is that the democracy schools really make an effort to bring together in a shared space people who may not necessarily agree and may actually not necessarily recognize the other as a legitimate actor, but through this space they create respect and they create bonds that actually stay within the time that they're in this democracy school experiment together, but then also beyond. And I have been very impressed with what I saw in the Tunisian context. I'm wondering if you could share with us a particular moment or example where you thought, wow, this democracy school here in Kenya is really making a difference. How could you tell that people, young men and women, were opening up to one another and were beginning to trust one another, especially across tensions or divides?
Yeah, and you're right. Beyond the learning and teaching and the lectures within the democracy schools, there's a whole lot of other things that happen on the sidelines that are not really, you don't find them in the modules. Number one is cross-party, cross-organization kind of engagement, because it's very rare to find young people from different political organizations or parties really sitting on the same table and discussing youth issues, and them realizing that in as much as I could be from a government-led party or opposition-led party, as young people, we all faced basically with the same issues. And so, of course, that creates a lot of shared understanding of the issues that they face as young people, with a lot of cohesion and trust that is built over time. A lot of friendships are built within the schools, and we've had quite a number of examples where democracy school alumni have come together. We have a group of 3 ladies within our first cohort who came together and set up a consulting firm. And they're fairly young ladies, in 3rd year, 4th year in university. They set up a consulting firm, and they're now, they're doing very small engagements in their communities or in their neighborhoods or universities, where they are sensitizing fellow students on various governance issues, on the constitution, talking about how they can participate in a deeper way in politics. They are bidding for jobs where they want to, if it's rapporteuring in meetings, So it was really encouraging just seeing that with our fellow alumni. Another instance is the alumni came together to review a critical bill that was being proposed in the Senate last year. There was a bill that was brought in to extend term limits of all elected positions, from the county level to the president, to extending the term from 5 years to 7 years. So the alumni came together and sat down to review that proposed bill and give objections to it. And that came about from one module. There's a module that was delivered in the school on legislative processes and how they can plug into legislative processes. Because in Kenya, whatever law that is proposed, it has to go through public participation where different stakeholders give their views. So when they did that exercise, practical exercise in school, And this particular bill, which was not popular, was brought to the Senate. They were able to pull together, and we offered them space within our boardroom, and they spent an entire nearly 3/4 of a day just going through that legislation. And we asked one of our partners, one of our implementing partners, to come guide them through it. Muzalendo Trust, they sent one of their staff members, because they do a lot of legislative scrutiny and post-legislative scrutiny. So a gentleman was able to guide them through it, and they were able to put together a memorandum, which they submitted to the Senate, the Justice and Legal Affairs Committee of the Senate, saying how this law is unconstitutional and should not be considered by the Senate. Of course, in that period, we had a lot of stakeholders give views. I think the Senate said they received over 2,000 emails or more, saying that law should not be enacted, and our alumni were part of those who officially submitted a memorandum, and that's work we've been doing with them. We are about to support them to review the budget policy statement for the next financial year, so that they can also give their views as young people to it. And so we've had those are two key ones, but we've had a lot more subtle ones where young people, the alumni, are just expanding their spheres of influence in their communities. They are a lot more confident appearing on Twitter X Spaces, where there are panelists or moderators, where some of them are writing articles. They're a lot more confident writing articles or blogging on their social media pages. Following our media and communication training, where they were tasked to write speeches and opinion pieces. So we've had a lot of that going on with our democracy school alumni, with our democracy academy that was targeting members of the Senate and National Assembly. Of course, we've had a few members who've been able to propose more legislations within the National Assembly and Senate. We've had there's a very notable senator who was part of our democracy academy. Her name is Senator Crystal Asige, and she's there representing persons with disability in the Senate. She presented a persons with disability bill that was enacted unopposed in the Senate. That's just there to ensure that there's a lot more inclusion of persons with disabilities across all sectors. It's more or less effecting a certain provision in the Kenyan constitution that touches on persons with disabilities. And so we are seeing those small steps here and there in the course of the work we're doing.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about young people sort of coming back and participating in a policy process or to contest what the government may want to be doing is part of this awareness raising and part of involving them more fully in the political process. Do you have a feeling for whether and how they might actually decide to vote next time around, or do you think they will continue to withdraw from the ballot box?
I think there'll be a lot more interest to vote and participate. And there are various ways one can participate apart from voting. If it's taking part in party primaries, because Kenya, most of the key candidates come from political parties in Kenya. The independents are quite few. And so if it's them finding spaces and pockets within their respective political parties to effect change at that level, there's a lot more interest in that. We had a good number of young people in democracy schools who were not members of any political parties, but after they graduated, they felt that they would be most effective within a political party, right? And that's where they'll be able to effect most change. There are those who still feel that they can run as independents, and that's allowed. Within our constitution, within law, it's allowed. And so there's a lot more interest, and among young people, there's been I think following the Gen Z movement last year, they've come to realize that if they're able to put together all their numbers, they'll be able to effect change. So leading up to the next election, we'll have a lot more young people participating at various levels. If it's just civic education, if it's voting, if it is participating in political parties, if it's presenting themselves as candidates, a good number are saying they want to present themselves as candidates. We'll have a lot more of that going into the next election. Because young people have realized that they actually have a strong voice. And if they coalesce, put together their voices into one, they can effect change, meaningful change. And even with that, we've seen political parties change strategies, because young people in parties are now holding their political leaders a lot more accountable. So we have parties now coming up with what you call campus chapters, because they realize there's a strong movement among universities, young people in universities, that they can tap into, and they need to bring into the center of decision making in political parties. So there's already that change happening in a small way, and of course it will all compound leading to the next election.
Oh, well, that's amazing. So it sounds like there's been quite a bit of progress, at least within the remit of NIMD, in terms of actually getting people to engage more fully in the political process and to try to hold politicians to account rather than to just be disillusioned and withdraw. So that's really, really encouraging. I wanted to ask you one final question, if I may. And just looking back at your experience with NIMD, what lessons do you think emerge from working with these young people that can inform other efforts around strengthening democracy elsewhere? And what is it about ways of working that you have embraced within NIMD that you think have been really important, that you would like to share with others as well?
Well, to start with, I've worked in this sector for about, I know when you were introducing me, you mentioned 12 years. It's been, I think this is my 18th year.
Oh my God, so I made you younger than you are. It's 18 years.
Yeah, and I've worked a lot with young people. I've worked a lot with young people. I've done a lot of party strengthening work over the years. And a key thing with our work is we're trying to ensure that it's locally driven, right? So we feed off our engagement with key political actors and key political players. So if we are working with young people from political parties, we talk to them about what kind of issues they have and how they feel. As a partner, we can support them in addressing them, or how do we equip them to better participate and be more involved in political processes and in governance. So within NIMD, we do a lot of listening. We talk to our partners, we listen a lot, we ask them, we co-create. A key element is co-creation, where we co-create interventions and activities. We look at big picture, what kind of outcomes do we envision, do we see, and how can we work together, towards it. So it's more of working hand in hand with our partners, and that's very key, because I've been in programs in the past where it's more top down, where you meet with a partner and you tell them this is the kind of intervention we are doing, we want to implement with you, and there's very little or minimal engagement in terms of the design and delivery. And so with NIMD, it's quite flexible and adaptable to the local context, and largely driven by the partners we are working with. So that's a very key element in the work we do, and it's very enjoyable work. When you're able to sit with partners and together analyzing the political environment, all the variables, how fluid it is, and discussing interventions with them. It's not easy, but it's also very enjoyable, where you hear them saying, this is how we should approach this issue or that issue.
Yeah. So it sounds like it's quite intensive in terms of building those relationships, fostering those relationships, and engaging with partners as equals, and creating programs of work and agendas of work that are really anchored in what people locally think is necessary. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I don't know if you have any other questions that you may have for us, but it has been really lovely to have you, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you for having me.